It was supposed to be an ordinary drive home after a long day in court, but for Judge Angela Carter, one of the youngest black judges ever appointed in her state, that night would turn into a battle of dignity, prejudice, and power played out. In the glare of flashing red and blue lights, she had just left the courthouse, her robe folded neatly in the back seat, her case files stacked beside her, and her mind wandering between exhaustion and pride over the groundbreaking decisions she had delivered earlier that day. The streets were quiet, the hum of her luxury sedan a steady companion, until the shriek of a siren cut through the silence and a spotlight suddenly washed over her car. At first, Angela assumed it was a routine traffic stop, maybe a broken taillight or a random check, but the way the officer stormed toward her window with his hand already on his holster made her stomach tighten. License and registration, he barked, not even bothering with the polite tone most officers used. When she calmly reached for her purse, he leaned closer, his eyes narrowing on her face before darting suspiciously to the car's leather interior. "Whose vehicle is this?" he demanded. "It's mine," Angela replied evenly, though she already sensed where this was going. His laugh was sharp, mocking. "A car like this? Yeah, right. You expect me to believe you own it. Step out of the vehicle now." The officer's words dripped with the kind of casual racism Angela had witnessed in countless cases. But living it firsthand was different. Around them, neighbors began peeking out of windows. A couple of pedestrians slowed their walk to watch. And Angela felt the sting of humiliation as the officer raised his voice, accusing her of car theft loud enough for everyone to hear. The longer she sat there, the more surreal it became. A woman who had sentenced criminals, upheld the Constitution, and carried the weight of justice on her shoulders, was now being treated like a suspect on the street. Her authority erased, her identity reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin. Inside, a storm brewed. Part of her wanted to shout back, to throw her title in his face. But another part knew that silence and composure were her only weapons in this moment. "I said, step out of the car," he repeated, his hand tightening on his holster, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. Every second stretched longer, every breath felt like a gamble. And Angela realized this wasn't just about her career, it was about something far bigger. A confrontation that would test not only her patience, but the entire system she represented. And as the officer prepared to escalate even further, Angela reached slowly into her purse, her next move carrying the power to flip the entire situation on its head and end his career in the blink of an eye. Angela Carter had never been one to seek attention, though her very presence often demanded it. A tall, striking black woman with a calm authority that came not just from her title as judge, but from the unshakable dignity she carried everywhere she went. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood where sirens were more common than lullabies, Angela had clawed her way up the ladder through grit, brilliance, and a relentless refusal to be underestimated. She was the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, and though her parents instilled discipline and pride, the world around her was filled with reminders of how easily those qualities could be dismissed when wrapped in black skin. As a law student, she had been underestimated, mistaken for an assistant or a clerk more times than she could count. And even after donning the black robe of a judge, she knew her authority did not shield her from prejudice, it only made it sting more sharply when it cut through. On the evening of the incident, Angela was still processing the day's work. A grueling series of cases involving young defendants who reminded her of kids from her own block, kids who hadn't had her parents' guidance or her stubborn will to resist the system's grip. She had fought through exhaustion to deliver rulings that upheld fairness and demanded accountability from those who thought justice could be bought or bent. That pride carried her into the driver's seat of her sedan, a vehicle she'd purchased, not to flaunt wealth, but as a personal marker of how far she'd come from the cracked sidewalks and rusted bus stops of her childhood. The car gleamed under the dim streetlights, its quiet purr a reminder of long nights and sacrifices that had led her here. But Angela knew the car was also a magnet for assumptions, a silent question mark in the minds of those who saw a black woman behind the wheel of something too polished, too expensive, The officer who pulled her over that night was the embodiment of those assumptions. His very posture spelling out his certainty that she did not belong in that driver's seat. As neighbors began to gather in the background, Angela felt not only the weight of his suspicion but also the eyes of the community. People who might not know who she was but who understood the story playing out. Another black person confronted, accused, diminished. She could almost feel their thoughts, their collective exhaustion at a script they'd seen too many times before. And in that moment, Angela became more than just a judge defending her dignity. She became a symbol of every battle fought in silence. Against the grinding machinery of prejudice, she remembered her father's words from years ago, warning her that no matter how high she climbed, there would always be people waiting to drag her back down, and her mother's softer but equally stern advice to never let anger dictate her decisions, because anger could be twisted, while composure was unshakable. Those lessons steadied her heartbeat as she sat in the driver's seat, watching the officer's growing agitation, listening to his accusations about a car he insisted could never be hers. Each second that ticked by built a strange duality inside her, the professional judge who knew the importance of restraint, and the weary black woman who was tired of being questioned, tired of having to prove her right to exist in spaces she had earned. The setting around Hertha, quiet suburban street, now buzzing with tension. The flashing lights that painted her in red and blue. The murmurs of bystanders who recorded from sidewalks turned into a stage, and though she had not chosen this performance, Angela knew her every word and gesture would matter. Curiosity hung heavy in the air. Who was she really, and what would she do next? To the officer, she was just a suspect to be broken down. To the neighbors, she was another case in a long history of injustice, but to herself, she was still Judge Carter. And she knew that the line between humiliation and vindication was about to be drawn not by the uniform standing over her, but by the quiet power she carried within. The officer's voice cut sharper through the night air. His words heavy with accusation, and every syllable seemed to carry not just suspicion, but contempt. As though the very idea of a black woman behind the wheel of such a car was an insult to his authority. He circled Angela's sedan with exaggerated movements, dragging the beam of his flashlight across the gleaming paint like a weapon, tapping the glass impatiently with the butt of his hand, demanding again that she step out and stop resisting, even though she hadn't moved an inch. And with each order, his volume rose, designed to broadcast guilt before innocence could ever be considered. Angela sat still, her hands deliberately visible on the steering wheel. The years of courtroom discipline and parental teachings running like a script in her mind. Stay calm. Do not give him an excuse, every move is evidence. Yet even as she steadied her breathing, she could feel the sting of humiliation deep in her chest. Not just for herself, but for the truth she knew was being played out in front of onlookers. The truth that no level of achievement, no robe, no gavel, no title, could shield her from the reach of prejudice. The officer leaned closer, his face inches from hers, and sneered as he demanded proof of ownership, scoffing at her insurance papers, declaring them too new, suggesting the registration was probably forged, his tone dripping with the certainty that his narrative, not hers, was reality. Around them, the crowd thickened. Some people whispered nervously while others recorded the encounter on their phones, their cameras capturing the trembling fury in his voice and the rigid composure in Angela's posture. She could hear snippets of conversations, someone muttering, "This isn't right," another saying she looks like she knows something he doesn't, while a child clutched her mother's hand and asked why the police were yelling. The humiliation spread like wildfire, but so did curiosity, because while Angela remained calm, there was something in her eyes, an unspoken strength. A warning almost that hinted she was not the powerless figure the officer believed her to be. The officer, oblivious to that undercurrent, grew bolder. He opened the driver's side door without permission, gesturing aggressively for her to get out, his hand brushing the grip of his holstered gun as though daring her to resist. His words, now loud enough for the entire block to hear, "You're under suspicion for vehicle theft, ma'am, and if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to cuff you." The crowd gasped at the escalation, a chorus of disapproval rising, Yet he pressed forward, intoxicated by the authority of his badge and blinded by the bias in his own eyes. Angela's heart pounded, but her face remained unreadable, her silence cutting through his noise like a quiet protest. And in that silence was history itself. Every relative she'd heard stories about who had endured unjust stops, every defendant she'd seen dragged into her courtroom on charges rooted more in perception than fact. Every headline she'd ever read about lives destroyed in an instant of prejudice. Her restraint became a kind of defiance, and though the officer mistook it for weakness, it was in fact the gathering storm of truth. The neighbors, sensing something extraordinary brewing beneath the surface, leaned in closer, their phones capturing every second, and tension hung thick in the air like a drumbeat waiting for its crash. Angela knew the risks one wrong move could end not only her career but her life, but she also knew the power she carried was unlike any he could imagine, and the moment to wield it was drawing near. The injustice was already clear. An accomplished judge stripped down to suspect by nothing more than the color of her skin. Her authority erased by a man who believed his uniform gave him the right to define reality. And yet, as the officer demanded once more that she step out, threatening to call for backup, promising she would regret this, Angela felt the weight of choice pressing down on her shoulders. Endure the humiliation further, or reclaim her power in a single move that would not only shatter his perception but forever mark the night as the moment his career unraveled. Every tick of the clock stretched like eternity, the crowd's murmurs growing louder, the flashing lights painting a surreal theater of injustice. And at its center sat Angela Carter, yet unyielding, preparing to deliver a revelation that would transform the narrative, expose the prejudice, and remind everyone watching that power, when wielded with dignity, could cut sharper than any weapon. The night had reached a boiling point, the air thick with tension as the officer's voice grew sharper, more threatening, each command echoing down the quiet street like the clang of a gavel sealing a fate. And yet Angela Carter remained seated, her calm defiance almost eerie against the storm of aggression raging inches from her window. "Step out of the vehicle now, or I will drag you out in cuffs," he barked, his hand hovering near his holster as though daring her to resist, while behind him the small crowd of neighbors pressed closer, their phones raised like shields, recording every twitch of his jaw and every word dripping with contempt. Children clutched their parents' legs. Grown men shook their heads in disbelief, and women whispered prayers under their breath. Knowing they were watching more than a traffic stop, they were watching a battle of dignity versus arrogance, truth versus prejudice, power versus restraint. Angela's hands, still steady on the wheel, betrayed none of the fury building in her chest, but inside her pulse throbbed with the weight of centuries of injustice. And she realized this was not just her fight, but the fight of everyone who had ever been profiled, dismissed, or humiliated for the color of their skin. She drew in a deep breath, then with a slowness that made the world around her hold its breath, she reached into her purse, ignoring the officer's frantic shouts of "Don't move," and "Keep your hands where I can see them." Her fingers brushed against the leather case that carried more authority than the weapon at his side, and when she withdrew it, the crowd leaned in collectively, eyes wide, waiting to see what secret this poised, unyielding woman would reveal. She held it up at eye level, flipping it open with practiced precision, and the gold-embossed seal of the state gleamed under the harsh beam of his flashlight, her official judicial identification card. The kind only a sitting judge could possess. For an instant, the world seemed to freeze. The officer's voice caught in his throat. The sneer drained from his face, and his eyes flickered wildly between the card and the woman he had been moments away from dragging onto the pavement like a common criminal. A ripple of gasps ran through the crowd, followed by murmurs of shock. She's a judge. Did he just accuse a judge of stealing her own car? And the officer, once so certain of his control, now looked like a man stripped bare, his authority crumbling in the glow of the very lights he had thought would protect him. Angela finally spoke, her voice steady, low, but carrying the cutting weight of truth. "Officer, you are detaining a sitting judge without probable cause, humiliating me in public, And every second of this encounter is being recorded, not just by those cameras, but by yours as well. I strongly suggest you think carefully about your next move." The power in her words sliced through the chaos like a scalpel. And the officer staggered back as if struck, his hand falling limply away from his holster, sweat glistening on his brow as he stammered half-formed excuses about misunderstandings and just following protocol. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Their phones captured not just his unraveling composure, but the undeniable truth that his prejudice had nearly destroyed him. And murmurs turned to pointed comments, some calling for his badge, others demanding accountability, their voices rising. In a chorus of condemnation, Angela did not raise her voice, did not gloat or shout. But the sheer contrast between her composed authority and his reckless arrogance delivered the most crushing blow of all, the silent verdict that exposed him as guilty in the court of public opinion. In that charged moment, the flashing red and blue lights no longer represented his control but his disgrace, illuminating the reality that the man who wore the badge was now the man on trial. And Judge Angela Carter had just passed the sentence, with nothing more than her presence, her dignity, and the truth that could no longer be denied. The flashing lights eventually faded, but the memory of that night burned itself into every witness, every phone recording, and most of all, into the heart of Officer Reynolds. The man who thought his badge gave him the right to humiliate a woman who stood taller than he could ever imagine. In the days that followed, the videos spread like wildfire, first across the neighborhood, then through local news channels, and finally onto national platforms where headlines screamed of racist officer detains black judge over her own car. And the nation debated what it meant for justice when even those who embodied it were not safe from prejudice. Angela Carter, once a quiet figure of authority who preferred her work to speak louder than her name, suddenly found herself thrust into the spotlight. Praised as a symbol of dignity under fire, her composure and restraint hailed as a lesson in power reclaimed without violence. Community leaders invited her to speak at rallies, civil rights groups asked her to share her story, and parents showed their children the video as proof that calm strength could dismantle arrogance. Yet for Angela, the true weight of the moment was not the fame or recognition, but the reminder that her success did not shield her from injustice, it only made her testimony more vital, more undeniable. She returned to her courtroom days later, greeted with standing ovations from those who had seen her confrontation, but she did not bask in their applause. Instead, she used it as fuel to demand better training for law enforcement, accountability for misconduct, and reforms that would ensure fewer citizens, judge or not, would face the kind of humiliation she had endured. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds' career crumbled before his eyes, placed on suspension, investigated by Internal Affairs, and eventually dismissed from the force. His name became synonymous with arrogance undone by truth. And the same public he once wielded his authority over now saw him as the cautionary tale of unchecked bias. Neighbors who had witnessed the encounter spoke at hearings, their testimonies blending with the video evidence to paint a picture that could not be denied. And the city itself was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive. But beyond the disciplinary actions, beyond the headlines, the greater impact lingered in the hearts of ordinary people who had watched the story unfold. Young black children who, for the first time, saw someone who looked like them, not broken down by injustice, but rising above it with undeniable power. Immigrants and marginalized voices who whispered Angela's name with hope, inspired to stand a little taller when questioned unfairly. And even allies within law enforcement who admitted the story shook them, forcing them to reflect on their own biases and the responsibilities that came with their badge. Angela herself carried the scars of the night. Quietly, she did not forget the sting of being called a thief in front of strangers, the shame of being treated as less than despite her position, but she also carried the triumph of knowing that dignity could be sharper than anger, and that her silence had thundered louder than the officer's shouts. She spoke often about that lesson in the years that followed, telling audiences that justice was not only what happened in the courtroom, but what people demanded in the streets, in their daily lives, in the moments when prejudice tried to rewrite reality. And in every retelling, she emphasized the same truth, that racism, no matter how deeply rooted, could be exposed and dismantled when courage met restraint. And that every act of resistance, big or small, was a thread pulling the fabric of injustice apart. The night on that quiet suburban street became more than just a personal battle. It became a landmark moment in the community's collective memory. A story replayed in classrooms, churches, and dinner tables as both a warning and a beacon. For Angela Carter, the resolution was not simply that she had cleared her own name or defended her dignity, but that she had turned humiliation into education, prejudice into proof, and silence into a verdict that resonated far beyond flashing lights. The impact rippled outward, a reminder that justice is not just a system locked behind courtroom doors, but a living demand carried by every person willing to stand, to endure, and to reveal the truth when it matters most. The night began like any other for Judge Angela Carter, a woman who carried the weight of justice on her shoulders with quiet strength. After hours of deliberating difficult cases, she slipped into her car, the luxury sedan she had purchased, not as a symbol of vanity, but as a personal reminder of how far she had come from the cracked sidewalks and rusted bus stops of her childhood. The city streets stretched before her, quiet and unassuming, as though the world had finally given her a moment of peace. Yet peace rarely lasted long in the lives of those marked by prejudice. And Angela knew it well enough to brace herself whenever flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. The shrill cry of a siren pierced the night, a harsh interruption to her thoughts, and within seconds a patrol car closed in behind her. At first, she wondered if she had unknowingly broken a minor traffic rule, perhaps a faulty taillight or a random check. But the speed and aggression with which the officer emerged told her otherwise. He approached with suspicion etched into every step, his hand brushing against his holster as though her presence alone was a threat. The neighbors peeking from windows, the pedestrians slowing their walk, and the curious eyes of onlookers soon turned a quiet street into a stage. Angela sat perfectly still, her hands visible, her breathing steady, while humiliation bloomed in her chest as accusations rained down on her. She had seen this story in her courtroom countless times, innocent people reduced to suspects, dignity stripped away by prejudice, but experiencing it firsthand carved a wound deeper than any second-hand testimony ever could. The officer moved with an authority that assumed guilt, circling her car with exaggerated steps, shining his flashlight across the gleaming paint as though searching for evidence of theft. To him, the sight of a black woman in a luxury car was proof enough that something was amiss. The registration papers were dismissed as suspicious, the insurance brushed off as fake, and the entire weight of his assumptions pressed down on Angela like a cage. The crowd murmured with unease, phones lifted to capture the unfolding injustice, their lenses reflecting both the arrogance of authority and the quiet endurance of a woman refusing to be broke inside Angela's mind. Years of experience collided. With raw emotion, she remembered her father's warnings that no matter how far she climbed, prejudice would follow, and her mother's steady reminder that composure could dismantle arrogance in ways anger never could. Those lessons steadied her as the officer escalated, opening her car door without consent, demanding she step out, and threatening to cuff her in front of everyone. He carried himself like a man certain of victory, certain that his badge outweighed her humanity. Yet Angela knew something he did not, that his downfall was only moments away. She reached into her purse with deliberate calm, her movements controlled, ignoring the officer's frantic shouts. Her hand closed around the leather case that held her identity, not just as a woman, but as a sitting judge, one of the youngest in her state, sworn to uphold the law he had just trampled beneath his boots. When she raised the case and flipped it open, the golden seal of the state gleamed under the harsh beam of the flashlight. For the first time that night, silence swept across the street. The officer froze, his sneer collapsing into disbelief, the arrogance draining from his posture as though the ground had vanished beneath him. The crowd gasped, whispers rippled shock. Then recognition, and suddenly the stage had flipped. Angela's voice carried no rage, no raised pitch, only the unyielding authority of truth. In that moment, the power he thought he held shattered. Like glass, the recordings captured not just her composure, but his unraveling. Sweat glistened on his brow as he fumbled for excuses, his voice a shadow of the confidence it once held. The badge on his chest no longer symbolized control. It symbolized disgrace. Before dozens of eyes, he transformed from the accuser into the accused, from the enforcer into the embodiment of injustice. Angela had not needed to shout or resist. Her dignity alone had dismantled his authority. In the days that followed, the story did not fade. The videos spread from block to block, city to city, until headlines across the country told of a racist officer who had profiled a black judge and humiliated himself in the process. Angela became more than a figure in a courtroom. She became a symbol. Communities praised her restraint, civil rights groups invited her to speak, and parents showed their children her story as a lesson in the quiet power of dignity. Yet Angela herself carried the experience not as a triumph but as a reminder. Success and titles could not shield her from injustice, only magnify its reach. She returned to her courtroom with renewed purpose, no longer seeing her bench as just a seat of rulings but as a platform to demand accountability, training, and change. For Officer Reynolds, the consequences came swiftly. Investigations stripped away the shield of his badge, and suspension turned to dismissal. His name became synonymous with arrogance undone by truth. A cautionary tale of how prejudice could destroy a career in a single night. The neighbors, who had once stood as silent spectators, now spoke as witnesses in hearings. Their testimonies backed by recordings that could not be denied. His downfall was not a tragedy, was justice revealing itself outside the walls of any courtroom, but the true impact reached beyond the individuals involved. Young children who watched the video saw, perhaps for the first time, someone who looked like them refusing to bend under the weight of humiliation. Immigrants and minorities who had felt powerless whispered Angela's name with hope, finding in her story a spark of courage. Even some within law enforcement admitted it forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, responsibility, and the culture they carried. Angela's calm defiance had become more than self-defense. It had become a mirror held up to society, reflecting both its flaws and its possibilities. As months turned into years, the night on that quiet suburban street became a chapter retold in classrooms, sermons, and dinner conversations. It was remembered not just as a confrontation, but as a revelation, proof that dignity could wound deeper than defiance, and that truth, when revealed with restraint, could be sharper than any weapon. For Angela Carter, the scars of humiliation never fully faded, but neither did the triumph of knowing she had turned pain into power. She carried that balance with her into every courtroom, every speech, every moment when justice seemed fragile, reminding those who listened that resilience was not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to be broken by it. And so the story resolves not simply with the fall of one officer or the rise of one judge, but with a lesson that echoes beyond time and place, that racism, no matter how disguised in authority or cloaked in procedure, cannot withstand the steady force of truth. It asks each of us how many more Angelas must endure before dignity no longer has to prove itself in the face of prejudice. How many more nights must be lit by sirens before justice truly extends to all. In the end, this is not just the story of a judge who defended her name. It is the story of a system that must be confronted, a prejudice that must be dismantled, and a reminder that silence, when used with strength, can be louder than any shout. And as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, if dignity can dismantle arrogance, what role do you play in dismantling racism? Because change does not begin with a courtroom or a badge. It begins with the courage to stand